Welcome back, everybody. Today we're coming in hot, we're coming in steamy after a bit of a break. Had to finish up school and everything. We have the longest player profile I've done to date, the one I'm most excited to share with y'all, and that is Michael Thomas. I don't want to waste too much time, so buckle in, buckle up, get ready, because we're going on a wild ride talking about why Michael Thomas has been criminally underrated this year. So before jumping into where we are now, let's take a little bit of a stroll down memory lane and talk about last year. Before last year, Michael Thomas was coming off an absolutely historic 2019 campaign where he racked up 185 targets to the tune of 149 receptions, 1,725 yards, and 9 touchdowns. Absolutely ridiculous stat lines. Dude was tearing shit up the entire year. In fantasy, he put up 300.1 fantasy points in half PPR. I'm going to do all my calculations and numbers in half PPR. It's just the best compromise between everybody, and that was 18.8 points per game. Dating back to 2016, he would have been the wide receiver 2 overall, out of anybody. For 5 years, Michael Thomas was the second best receiver in that time period. He missed the wide receiver 1 spot by 0.8 against Devontae Adams this year, which admittedly is its own ridiculous accomplishment given he played in 13 and a half games and still did that. So with that, moving into last year, his ADP was sky high. Wide receiver 1 coming off the board, 6th player overall. You can't get much higher than that. And I'm not a guy who advocates for taking receiver early. In fact, it's quite the opposite. But last year, I really couldn't argue with you for taking a guy who was giving you such elite production on a weekly basis that early. He was that good. And then he proceeded to burn every single person who took him that high last year. And unless you hit on a lot of other picks and a lot of other waiver wire pickups, he likely derailed your season amongst every other running back who got hurt and other receivers. Injuries pretty much derailed the season immediately. He suffered a high ankle sprain in week 1, and it just lingered throughout the year and got worse from there. It ultimately left him useless. He really didn't do that much. He fucked up his hamstring in week 7, and then that was that. He finished the year as the wide receiver 98, which is about as far off of the wide receiver 1 as you can get. In points per game, he was 60th. If I'm being honest, I didn't count all the way down, because when you get that low at 9 points per game, you start to reevaluate your life choices and wonder what exactly you're doing, figuring out why Michael Thomas was so bad last year. Now that we know how we got here, let's take a look at where we are exactly. Where did the bus leave us? As of right now, Michael Thomas is the wide receiver 10 coming off the board in half PPR, 30th player overall. Shout out RotoWire for this up-to-date redraft ADP, better than the fantasy football calculator. That shit was weird. They had Jake Butt in the 5th round. But pretty far cry from where we were back to last year. And I, not Michael Thomas, feel personally insulted by this. People are taking him, burning them to heart. They're holding it against the man, as well as the fact that we've seen some other issues and a whole bunch of new kids, new transfer students step onto the playground with their fancy sidewalk chalk. Justin Jefferson, DK Metcalf, newly minted Buffalo Bills Stephon Diggs, and A.J. Brown have all hopped over him, just to name a few. I think some of these are warranted and you can make the case, and some of these personally aren't, like DK Metcalf, who had 9 good games, because that's what the Seahawks do. The offense peters out in one half of the year. But Thomas isn't like a lot of these guys. He's been doing this shit for a long time, and I think we're starting to fall into a bit of recency bias as well as just being mad at the dude for letting him fall so far. I know Michael Thomas has been great for a while. You know it too, but just how great. I'm going to show y'all with some numbers. It would be a little bit disingenuous of me to come on here and talk all this shit about how good Michael Thomas is. And I'll give you a little taste of what the man has done over the past few years. Rookie year was 2016, 2nd round pick, and from then to 2019, we're going to evaluate just what he's done, so a nice hearty 4-year sample size. From his rookie year onward, we were looking at wide receiver 7, wide receiver 6, wide receiver 6 again, and wide receiver 1. Immediately off rip, he's never finished worse than the wide receiver 7, which is incredible. Not only is he giving you great week-over-week consistency, but great year-over-year consistency as well. When you draft Michael Thomas, you know what you're getting. A top 8, top 7 guy who's going to produce for you on a week-in, week-out basis. And if you want to shift to points per game, here's what we got. Going from 2019 back, now switching the flow on you real quick. 18.8 points per game, finishing as the wide receiver 1. 15.8 points per game, wide receiver 7, 12.9 points per game, wide receiver 7, or 8. OBJ was above him with 4 games played, so we will say he's the wide receiver 8 for the sake of this. And 2016, 14 points per game, wide receiver 8. Even in his worst year, which was his rookie year, and then I guess the year after, they're tied if you want to count OBJ in there, he was top 8 in points per game and top 7 overall, which is incredible. So when you compare that to his ADP, which is wide receiver 10, you're pretty much guaranteed to get a value based on his prior production and what we've seen him do. The only way this doesn't happen is if he's outproduced by 10 other receivers, which literally hasn't happened in 4 years of his career so far, so I don't know why we would magically just assume that he would this year. I know some people are about new kids on the block, but I'm sticking with Michael Thomas. I really don't see a way how he's not a value purely off prior production alone and how that projects for this year. But after tooting some smoke up his ass about how he's done, it would be a little bit wrong of me to not mention what I think would be two biggest concerns about Michael Thomas coming into this year, and we're going to kick it off with the injury concerns. Last year, Michael Thomas sustained two pretty serious-ish injuries, high ankle sprain in Week 1 and a hamstring strain in Week 7. Outside of the preseason in 2016, his rookie year, these have been the only injuries he's ever sustained. That injury was a mild ankle sprain that put him on the injury report for, I believe, a week. Outside of that, up until this year, he had never been hurt before enough to miss a game or even go on an injury report. So outside of a preseason thing and then a kind of freaky 2020, the dude's been an Iron Man. He's been doing it all. He's been playing for his team, putting the city on his back. These injuries, though, did plague him last year, as high ankle sprains tend to do. We saw Saquon amongst a laundry list of other players try to come back from one too quick 2 years ago. And while he played and was technically active, he really wasn't doing much. He was nowhere near himself. And not using that specific case study, but just in general, we know high ankle sprains are bastards. They tend to linger throughout the whole season, and 1 week miss turns into 3 weeks miss, turns into 1 week back, into 4 week back with mediocre production. And all of a sudden the season's over and you're wondering what the hell happened. You're a stud receiver or you're a stud running back. I'm going to preface this about a minute in by saying I am by no means a medical expert, so if I am wrong with any of this, please feel free to correct my pretentious ass. I do not mind one bit. I'm going to try and tread lightly but also deliver as much fact as I can based on the research. He underwent surgery this offseason to repair a major torn ligament in the ankle, as well as just correcting some other stuff, a bit of cleanup duty, hitting out of the 4-hole Albert Pujols. And by all means, he should be more than ready to go by the start of the preseason and the regular season. I think he should be good for camp too. I really don't see why not. So why did he play through this? Why did he subject us all to this torment of not knowing whether to put him in our lineups or not when he came back, and then watching him struggle bust through the season? Because he wanted to give it all for Drew Brees' final campaign. Because watching Drew Brees himself was painful enough when our fantasy season wasn't going down with the rest of that shit. Doesn't mean much for fantasy unless your league has bonus points for character. I don't think mine does, but if yours does, all the power in the world to you. I mentioned Saquon with a high ankle sprain, but I didn't mention his teammate Alvin Kamara, who actually has a kind of similar, reminiscent situation. What happened? So 2019, when Michael Thomas was out there kicking ass, Kamara suffered a high ankle sprain in Week 6, missed time, and simply wasn't himself when he was on the field. After the year, however, he revealed that he tore his ACL and some other complications were there from the high ankle sprain, and he just kind of managed through it amongst the other high ankle sprain corrections. He ultimately got surgery in the offseason to correct the issue, and he bounced back by only finishing as the RB1 this year. Obviously, Kamara seemed to have more major complications from the knee injury, and he bounced back incredibly well. You might argue that running back 1 wasn't that impressive this year because the pool was limited because everyone got hurt, and to that I say, you're no fun at parties, go fuck yourself. So looking at the situation, you have two teammates who in back-to-back years suffered high ankle sprains and tried to will their ways through much more severe complications and ultimately weren't themselves, which hampered their fantasy managers. One of them got surgery, came back with 100%, and balled the hell out. I wonder what the other is going to do. Obviously, I know these aren't identical situations, just trying to provide you a bit of a handy-dandy parallel so you can see. Now, either one of these injuries is going to have a major long-term impact, so don't let them burning you last year turn into a reason to fade him this year. Moving from one concern that I think really has no substance moving into this year to one that admittedly does, it is the quarterback situation in New Orleans. Coming into last year, the major elephant in the room in NOLA, both fantasy-wise and for actual football, was whether or not Drew Brees was going to retire, whether he was going to come back, and subject us all to another wonderful year of watching him really try his best to throw the ball more than 8 yards down the field. For a while it seemed likely, then it kind of didn't, then it maybe did, then it didn't, then ultimately he just put himself out of his own misery and retired. And with that, there came quite a few concerns for the skill positions in New Orleans, so I don't know why that was so hard for me to say. I guess I just can't fathom a world without Drew Brees dump-offs. These concerns were more substantive for Alvin Kamara, given what we saw from him and Taysom Hill. Although he did relatively fine with Teddy Bridgewater, though, That's where we get to Michael Thomas. Michael Thomas played 7 games with Teddy Bridgewater as a starter. I'm going to make an executive decision to not count one. Why, you may ask? It was Week 17 of 2018. They had home field advantage locked up. Their seed was locked in. Nothing they could do in that game. They could have beaten the other team so bad they all just quit the league. Nothing would have happened, so they threw it. Benched their starters. Brees wasn't hurt. They just sat him. I believe Michael Thomas only played a half. They threw the week, and therefore I'm throwing it out of consideration to be included in these rankings. If you consider that faulty process, I do not care. My process is always faulty. Nothing I ever say makes sense. So we're just going to look at what his stats were from that week, those 6 weeks, and the total was 76 targets for 52 receptions, 640 yards, and 3 touchdowns. So if you average that up into a nice little per game pocket, you got 12.7 targets for 8.7 receptions, 106.6 yards, and 0.5 touchdowns. And then if you convert that again into half PPR fantasy points, you get 17.94. And if you want to just compare that to his season-long averages, it is the second highest mark of his career, short of only the entirety of his record-breaking year in 2019, which is 18.8, by less than 0.9. So with Teddy Bridgewater, Michael Thomas over a full season, I know it's a bit rough to do that, it's not always the most accurate, but it's what I got. He would have put up a season that was just shy of his record-breaking season. It would have been insanely elite production again from the dude. It's all he knows how to do when he steps on the field to produce like a farmer's market. It would have placed him as no worse than the wide receiver 3 overall over the past 5 years. Pluck him in 2016, top 3. 2018, top 3. 2020, top 3. Dude would have been top 3 no matter where you put him. So we have Teddy Bridgewater, and with him in that 6-game span, he showed elite production. Let's look at what he did exactly with Taysom Hill. Exactly similar to what I did with Teddy Bridgewater, that makes me a fraud. When I'm looking at the Taysom Hill sample size, I'm going to take one of these games out. So we're looking at a 3-game sample size. Why am I cutting another game out outside of me being a complete fraud who doesn't know what he's doing? It's because it was the Kendall Hinton Broncos game. And that's about as bizarre as a football game can get, considering he attempted like 3 passes and he's a wide receiver. And I don't know why that game happened. I don't know why the NFL let that happen. It makes my video look bad because Michael Thomas didn't do good in a game that just should have never happened in the first place. If you want to know what his numbers were, they were 4 for 50. Really bad. Not going to count them, not because they make Michael Thomas look bad. I make myself look bad enough. It's because that game is never going to happen. In such a circumstance, just really won't ever pop up again. In those 3 games, though, Michael Thomas averaged 10.3 targets, 8.7 receptions, 97.7 yards, and a whopping 0.0 touchdowns. Didn't score once because Taysom Hill did it all himself. He's the jack of all trades, master of none. Admittedly, it's not great points per game wise with 14.15, third highest number of his career over a full year, and will put him at the wide receiver 11 for this past year. So think about that. In this 3-game sample size where he was suffering from pretty damaging complications from a high ankle sprain, that is the only time this man has come close to being the wide receiver 10. It took an ankle injury, playing with a bozo tight end at quarterback, and about as small a sample size you can get before getting laughed out of the fucking, I don't even know, laughed out of anything. Laughed off of Twitter, laughed off of Facebook, laughed off of MySpace, laughed out of like a comedy store, anywhere you can go. 3 games is all you get before you really start to get disrespected. I would say, considering he was pretty injured, and considering Taysom Hill at that point was like even less of a quarterback than he is now, I'd say it's pretty decent. I'm not going to lie to you. So coming into this year, I spoiled it. Michael Thomas has 2 options at quarterback. Taysom Hill, which we've seen, and I personally think is the less likely option, and if he does play, it'll be in some weird quarterback by committee, or we get the fun option, we get to pick the mystery box, which could be anything. It could even be Taysom Hill, except it's not. It's Jameis Winston. And man, does Jameis Winston excite me for fantasy. Dude slings cock out there. Like him, hate him, blind as a bat, 30 for 30, 5K yards. I'm not talking ESPN. Dude has fun. And in 2019, when he went out there with Bruce Arians at the helm, he supported the wide receiver 2 in 14 games and the wide receiver 12 who played 13. If you look at that in points per game, Godwin was the wide receiver 2 and Evans was the wide receiver 3. In 2019, Jameis Winston supported 2 out of the top 3 fantasy receivers in terms of points per game. That is ridiculous. I can't even begin to fathom how wild that is, especially when you take into account that Jameis Winston wasn't that good as an actual quarterback. He was just lights out for fantasy. And sure, Arians' system is a plus. I'll admit it plays towards Winston's strengths of just chucking the ball and praying it lands in somebody's hands that's wearing the same color uniform as him. But Jameis is going to sling regardless. I don't think you're ever going to change that about the dude. The dude's decision making is on like a 0, and he just slings rock whenever he so feels like it. Like I said, more of that vertical passing. But in 2019, the passing percentage of plays, so that pass run split, only 2%, which over a full season does add up to quite a few plays, but not a major difference. I'm not going to count 2020 because you have Taysom Hill who can't pass the football. Jameis is quite possibly the most ridiculous fantasy quarterback I've ever seen. Sure, you got guys like Lamar Jackson who can just run it and tug it and do whatever the hell they want on the football field, but no one quite captures the heart and emotions quite like Jameis Winston. And taking a year to learn under Drew Brees, who's one of the best quarterbacks of all time despite the fact that his arm was falling off like a zombie in RE8, it's going to be incredibly beneficial for him, going to be incredibly beneficial for Michael Thomas. Like I said, supported the wide receiver 2 and 3 in points per game in 2019. He also supported the wide receiver 3 in points per game back in 2016, his second year. That was without Arians, different system, but I still wanted to show you that Winston could do it even without a much more favorable system. In between, he was a bit spotty for receivers, I'll give you that, but just wanted to show you that it's definitely there in the Arians system and without. So overall, where are we now? Looking at how we got here, how he burned everybody, what he's done in the past, and taking, and in my opinion, pretty handily debunking the 2 most warranted concerns against Michael Thomas. What do we do now? And I'm here to tell you, at the end of it all, we are criminally underrating Michael Thomas this year. The slant god is not one to be played with. He's looking jacked in the offseason. And him being the wide receiver 10 off the board is a joke. If we get Jameis Winston, and hell, even if we get Taysom Hill, or the weird quarterback by committee, or if Jameis Winston falls off a bridge and breaks his arm and needs LASIK again, and we just get Taysom Hill, being the wide receiver 1 is in play for Michael Thomas. Whenever he's on the field, it is in play. We are getting him at his absolute floor and then lower. He's never finished anywhere close to the wide receiver 10, outside of a 3-game sample size with Taysom Hill, where he was completely torn apart in the ankle. He was having a rough go of it. The concerns about him are unsubstantiated long term. The injuries are not going to bother him this year. The quarterback situation, like I've said, I don't think will be a concern. Even if it is Taysom Hill the entire year, which I doubt is possible. But if you want to take that worst case scenario outlook, you're getting him at his appropriate value, but there's no way he finishes that low. There's other people that are going to look at other receivers that broke out last year, like DK Metcalf, like Stephon Diggs, like all of them. Sure, they're nice, but they're not worth taking in the first round, in the second round. When you can get Michael Thomas here, and he will likely outperform most, if not all of them. He can perform with any quarterback when healthy. Doesn't matter who's under center, whether it's the most average man of all time, the weakest arm of all time, the most tight end quarterback of all time, and I'm not talking about the one Urban Meyer just signed. There is no reason for Michael Thomas to be this low. When I do my receiver rankings as the year gets closer, I don't see it possible for me to rank him outside of my top 3, and I don't think I'd be opposed to putting him as the wide receiver 1 overall, if you're being completely honest. Getting him at the tail end of the 3rd round is highway robbery, and if you miss out or you hold a grudge and do not take him, even if you have to reach in the 2nd round because you're at the tail and you don't think you're going to get your guy, do it. This is the year where Michael Thomas comes back and scorches earth, especially if James is under center, and you do not want to be on the receiving end of it. That's going to be it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed. I had a blast putting this one together. I never thought Michael Thomas would be so interesting outside of shit talking him for running 6-yard slants all day, but here we are. I'm all in on him. The more research I did, the more my confirmation bias kicked into effect. I see no holes with Michael Thomas's game this year on some Kevin Lee shit. I'm so ready for him to ball the hell out. So ready for him to be the top 3 receiver this year. Like I said, a wide receiver 1 finish really wouldn't surprise me. Hope I convinced you guys just a little bit as to why I feel so highly about him this year. And hopefully you can get in on him dynasty, redraft, best ball, campus to can. I don't care what format you play. Get your hands on some Michael Thomas this year, and I don't think you'll regret it at all. See ya.